Do we actually need a state at all? You know, it's this shock horror. Like, one person said to us today, with no government, well, then it would be anarchy. And we said, well, yeah.
Bingo. With no rape, there would just be lovemaking. Yes, that's exactly right. You are on the money. My philosophy is really founded on the non-aggression principle. That's sort of one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is respect for property rights, which is, you know, you could really argue it's just the same thing, and, you know, looked at from a different angle. So the non-aggression principle, thou shalt not initiate force against thy fellow man, and the respect for property rights. And I came to it through Ayn Rand, through objectivism, and sort of recognized that if you're going to do the non-aggression principle, I like to go all the way. Really, that's my philosophy. I'm not a tease. I'm not a second base guy. I'm not a third base kind of guy. I'm an all the way kind of guy. So eventually, after trembling on the edge of that brink of the non-aggression principle, probably about 6 or 7 years ago, I fell happily into the pit of accepting that a truly voluntary society is the only way that society can move forward, can avoid these endless collapses and wars and deaths and enslavements and all this kind of stuff. This grim, boring cycle of freedom followed by, you know, economic freedom breeds a whole lot of wealth. Government uses that wealth as collateral to borrow. It indebts, it enslaves, it prints, it inflates. And just, you know, if you see that cycle clearly enough, it gets really boring. And I hope that humanity will at some point get so bored of this cycle that they'll start looking for alternatives. Yeah, I think there's a tipping point. This wasn't such a scary idea in the past. I mean, there were lots of anarchists, very public anarchists in the past, from Tolstoy to Tolkien to Bakunin to lots of Prudhomme in many ways. So lots of very public voluntarists or anarchists, or people who, you know, are just consistent in their ethics as a philosophical. And of course, Lysander Spooner in the U.S. You can sort of go on and on, but it was sort of a more acceptable viewpoint in the past. I think really what's happened is there's a tipping point. So once you take away people's liberty to a particular degree, I don't know what percentage it is, you know, 20% maybe it's okay, 30, 40. Once you get sort of 30, 40, 50%, once you take away people's liberty to that degree, then liberty becomes a really painful concept to think about, because you've been robbed of so much that if you then really consider what it would be like to be free, it's really quite agonizing. You know, it's like going down to the dungeon of Louis XVII and putting up PowerPoint slideshows of Waikiki beaches to people who are chained to the wall. I mean, it's just kind of cruel. Yeah. And I think in particular, once the government gets control of the children, right? And this has been the case for almost 150 years now, that governments throughout the West are the ones who train the children. And so when people have problems in society, they always seem to take the government out of the picture when it comes to having trained the people, right? So Obama rails against the greed of Wall Street. It's like, well, you know, the government trained all those people, right? It either trained them directly through public schools or indirectly by certifying the teachers and setting the curriculum in private school. So if the government does not find its citizens satisfactory, then it needs to look in the mirror. I was like, dude, didn't you train those guys? I mean, so I think that, and so when the government takes your childhood, which is kind of what the government does, you know, thousands and thousands of hours of locked in these little ice cube trays of mass distraction, it's really painful. I mean, to have been shepherded around, to move around like a cow from bell to bell, regardless of your particular interest at the moment, to never be asked anything about what you want to study, to be simply shunted through for the convenience and summers off of your elders. That's really painful. I mean, there's a really deep, I think, emotional pain when people think of how it could have been, and I think that's one of the reasons why they shy away from it. Well, I mean, then this is a classic behavior of victims of abuse, right? That they believe that they can reform their abuser. This time it's going to be different. And, you know, they try and strike away from that abusive relationship. I mean, if you just look at the 20th century, just some basic facts. I mean, facts are important. Some people have calculated, you can Google the word democide, or your listeners can, have calculated that 250 million people were murdered by their own governments in the 20th century. That's not really good. And now, if you compare that to private murders, in the 20th century, private murders, depending on how you calculate it, it's about 8 million. Mm-hmm. So, on the one side, you have an entity which is considered necessary for the protection of people, killing almost 250 million people, murdering them. This doesn't even count wars. This is just death camps, starvation, forced marches, that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, you face the risk of 8 million private murders throughout the century. And the private motives, these include things like, the effects of the drug war, people raised in government schools who don't know how to think and who have really bad aggressive problems. It includes people who've come home from wars who are traumatized. Like, it includes a lot of government mix-up in that 8 million. Wouldn't be that nearly that high in a private society or a free society.
Yeah, there's a lot of these
but these are just basic facts that you're not supposed to know. Yeah, and I mean, America, right? America was this big fight against communism. Because communism, you see, had all of these gulags, and it was really bad. But the percentage of Americans in prisons for nonviolent crimes is really very close to what Solzhenitsyn and others were experiencing in the Gulag Archipelago under Stalin. And so how have you won the war when you're incarcerating a similar number? And of course, governments say, well, you need us. You see, you need us to save you from other governments. The other governments are really, really dangerous. And so you need us because these other governments could,
they're even worse.
Whatever, right? But the reality, of course, is that our governments are the biggest arms dealers in the world. If America feels that foreign, or the British government, of course, it's England, the UK, Russia, I mean, these are the big arms dealers. And if other governments are so dangerous, then perhaps we should stop arming them to the teeth. It's sort of like if you want an alarm system installed in your house and they say, well, there's lots of these thieves around. It turns out that the thieves are actually hired by the alarm company to threaten you, to get you to buy their services. We would recognize that as incredibly corrupt. And so governments are not protecting us from other governments. They are, in fact, robbing from us and selling off our kids in order to well arm all of these other governments. It's shocking. I mean, it's truly criminal. Yeah, and I mean, what a wonderful thing that would be if some thundering man god could ride over the horizon, crack his fiery whip of violence, and make the whole world stand into attention with peace, order, prosperity, and freedom. Wouldn't that be great? It would be great if I didn't need to take craps in the morning. It would be great if my hair all grew back. It would be great if I could live forever. And it would be great if my pet unicorn would actually come back when I called. But unfortunately, these things just aren't true, and we have to let the things of childhood go behind, of which a faith in the organizational use of violence seems to be one of the hardest to let go of for people. And there is the fantasy, and what a great fantasy it would be, right? So there's this objectivist or libertarian argument that, we're going to crush the state down to, the couple of major functions that the state should have: the police, the law courts, the military, maybe the prisons, and then that's it. So the government is an umpire, it's not a player. What we want to understand is, if that's the goal, the first place you look is history. I mean, that's the first place you want to look. You don't want to look into the fantasies of the future or the language manipulation you can create in your head about how things should be. You want to look at history and say, okay, has this been tried before? And what were the results? Well, just a couple off the top of my head. Ancient Rome started off as a pretty small government. That's one of the reasons why it had such growth. And the small government turned into a very large, corrupt republic, which became very imperialistic, and then finally crushed itself because it ran into so much debt that it couldn't pay off its mercenaries. Its mercenaries came and sacked Rome, reducing it from a population of about 1 million to a population of about 17,000, as everyone was sent out into the countryside in a true Cambodian-style death march into starvation. So this was a big problem. Big governments grow out of small governments. Small governments allow wealth to grow. Wealth becomes collateral. Wealth becomes higher taxes, which funds the ambitions of politicians. And you could look, England, of course, it was the first to implement really the modern concept of free trade in the 18th centuries. And England then became very wealthy. And what happened? It became very top-heavy. It became increasingly controlled. And, of course, it became imperialistic because sociopaths at the top love to lob grenades over to other countries. It lets them discharge their sadism. It helps them provoke foreign enemies, which allow them to cow the domestic population with, created threats. You poke a hornet's nest and say, oh my God, we need protection from hornets. Isn't that a shock? America, of course, is the biggest example and the one that most people would be most familiar with. America, of course, philosophically designed as the very smallest government. I mean, it was an atom on the face of the sun. It was the smallest government. I mean, okay, but let's discount the incredible murders of the domestic population, the Native Americans, the Indians. Let's discount no rights for women. Let's discount no rights for children. Let's discount slavery. Just looking at it through the lens of, white, middle class and uppers. It was the very smallest government that could be conceived of, philosophically designed by the geniuses of the age. And look what happened. It grew from the very smallest government that the world had ever seen to right now, the very largest government with the most power, the most destructive power that could be imagined that the world has ever seen. The power to destroy life on this planet dozens of times over. If that doesn't give people pause about the prospects for minarchism, then I suggest they rewind and listen again. The cancer always regrows. it's sort of like you want the surgeon to open up, cut away maybe 80% of the cancer, which is going to regrow, and then say, don't worry, I wrote the word Constitution on your cancer, so there's no way it's going to regrow. And then, of course, it all does. At some point, it's like, that last 20%, which we know is going to regrow and threaten our health again, just take that sucker out. I'll try life without the cancer at all. I really think that there's some great possibilities there. Well, there's no upward cap on its growth. I mean, for so many reasons. I mean, if you provide bad service in the free market, people stop buying from you. If you overcharge in the free market, people stop buying from you. There is, in voluntarism, there is a natural check and balance on the growth of power. If a large group of people think a corporation is getting too big or some organization is getting too big, there would be no corporations in a free society. They're state-created monsters too. But if some organization is getting too big, people are like, okay, hey, I'm going to just stop dealing with these guys, and then they collapse. They can't go out and buy an army. I mean, that's going to be completely obvious to everyone. And so government has no limit on its upward growth. And the way, of course, the government works, which is we all know, is the government will give you stuff for free. And the way that it does that, of course, is it prints and it borrows, right? It prints money and it borrows money. And not one person in 1,000 can usually trace back inflation 2 years after the fact to the printing money that occurred to pay for some particular social program. And more importantly, it goes into debt, right? So if you look at a lot of the wealth that the baby boomers have created or gathered, a lot of it is because the government paid for a whole bunch of stuff that they otherwise would have had to pay for, from roads to healthcare to old age pensions and so on, and to the education of their children. Government paid for all of that by going into debt. So they got a huge amount of free stuff. The debt now rolls into the next generation. And this is inevitable. In public choice theory, you can read about this online. There's no mathematical possible way that the size of government can be restrained or controlled. The benefits of taking a penny from 1 million people and giving it to some guy are far too great. And so the guy who's getting, whatever it is, a penny from 1 million people, he's going to have a huge incentive to keep that going. You and I have 1 penny's worth of incentive to stop it. And so it ends up with death by 1,000 mosquito bites and the slow suicide of a once noble culture. Well, I mean, this is the basic problem. I mean, obviously, if all men are good, then we don't need a government. If all men are bad, we can't have a government because the bad men will use the government to dominate everyone else. If the majority of men are good and the minority of men are bad, the bad people will take over the government and use it to dominate the good. If the majority of people are bad and a minority is good, same thing happens. There's no logical way under which the distribution of good and evil in society can justify the existence of a government. I mean, look, we're mammals. We want to, like all living organisms, we want maximum returns with minimum effort. And the government, of course, provides that, and it swells and justifies. And the other thing that's true is that the people have no respect for wisdom or deep study in the realm of government or political science or even economics. I mean, as Murray Rothbard said, isn't it? It's no crime to be ignorant of economics. It's a complicated discipline, but it kind of is a crime to think that you know something when you don't. And stuff which just seems obvious to people, which they're told repeatedly, which is just not true. The people think that they know something about it, and they really don't. And unfortunately, I mean, in other disciplines, that's kind of understood. I don't sort of wake up one day, do a couple of stretches and say, that's it, I'm ready for the Olympic hurdles, right? I mean, I recognize that it takes years of training and dedication to become an expert in this. And the average idiot on the street thinks that he knows something because he's seen a couple of ads and he was indoctrinated by his public school into how wonderful government is. He thinks he knows something about it. And false knowledge is the true enemy of knowledge. I mean, if you know that you don't know something, you can go and find it out, or at least admit that you don't know it. But if you think you know something that ain't so, that's the really dangerous problem. And most people have an understanding of political science from their government schools in the same way that people who look at McDonald's ads on TV have an understanding of nutrition. I mean, they're all just commercials. There's no substance to them. How the hell are we supposed to be taken seriously as a species when we come up with these absolutely absurd things like we say, I need the government to protect my property and I'm going to give them the right to take half of it by force. I want the government to protect the family, though it's shredded over the past few generations. I want the government to protect me from criminals. The government is largely responsible for producing them. I want the government to protect me from foreign governments, which your government is arming. So how in the world do they think we can get through the day? Yes, and as I've asked this of a wide variety. I speak at a lot of conferences, and I've asked this of a wide variety of people in the audience. I say, well, how many of you have gone to jail for your beliefs? And, maybe 1 or 2 people will put their hand up. And then I say, well, how many of you have received social ostracism and criticism and significant social problems because of your beliefs? Every single person puts their hands up every single time. And that really is the government. The government is horizontal, right? The government gets us to attack each other for speaking the truth, and then they profit from that. They don't monitor us. We monitor each other. It's slave-on-slave violence that produces the state, and only makes the state possible. The state is an effect of our willingness and sometimes lust to attack each other for speaking the truth. Is the initiation of force is immoral. The problem is taxation is theft. The problem is that incarceration for nonviolent crimes is kidnapping and imprisonment, and it's wrong, it's immoral. Selling off the unborn, the productivity of the unborn for the sake of bribing constituents in the here and now is wrong, it's immoral. We have to take that moral stand. I don't care what happens 100 years from now once we have stopped using violence to solve social problems. I don't care how people get married once we stop raping everybody. We have to stop using force and imagining that it's good.